Hi, I'm Jerry Bowyer. Thanks for joining us today. Our guest is someone who has a fascinating idea about the relationship between the genders in our modern world, particularly the impact that it has on men. She's a psychologist who specializes in forensic issues and men's issues. She's also a blogger for PJ Media, and she's the author of Men on Strike, Why Men Are Boycotting Marriage, Fatherhood, and the American Dream, and Why It Matters. My guest is Dr. Helen Smith, psychologist, PhD. Just Helen to her friends, so I'm not going to, as you've indicated, I'm not going to call you Dr. Smith throughout this interview. So first of all, Helen, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Jerry. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so do we need to defend any longer the idea that men are on strike, or has there been enough commentary about the withdrawal of men from higher education and to some degree from the job market and the marriage market, that is now no longer a controversial idea, that men are, in some sense, not functioning in a proper, completely connected way with modern society?
Well, I think people think it's always controversial when you say anything positive about men or try to stand up for them. But I think that you're right. I think that there's been a lot of information out there, and there have been a lot of books about men not getting married or going to college. There have been books like Hannah Rawson's End of Men or Manning Up, Kay Heimowitz, or Save the Males. And the basic message of these books has always been that men are acting immaturely. And the reason I wrote the book is that actually I think men are acting rationally. The rewards for men in the fields of marriage, education, career, and fatherhood are just a lot less than they used to be, and the costs and dangers are just a lot higher. And so they're opting out. And whether people want to believe this or not, it's happening.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned Kay Heimowitz's book, which is in some ways similar to yours, but in other ways very different. Mm-hmm. Let's not single her out in particular, but there does tend to be a scoldy tone. And
yes,
that's really going to work with men, right? There does tend to be a scoldy tone in a lot of the, what's wrong with men vein, the failure to launch, they're not going to college, they're not participating in the economy. A tone that seems to, interestingly, for liberals, place no obligation whatsoever or no causal effect whatsoever on larger societal factors.
No, I mean, I definitely think there is a scolding factor, and I think people are so used to shaming men, and that's very prevalent in the culture. I think that we see, there's so many messages through the commercials, through the media, that men are just no good, and so it's so easy to pick up and say that, yeah, men are worthless, men can't, they're not good fathers, or we've got so many messages out there, and I think that's just a really negative thing to be sending to men, and particularly young boys in schools and in society. Going back to some of these books like The End of Men or Manning Up, you're right. The message is basically, you know what, you're doing this because you're just an immature man. And there's a chapter in Heimowitz's book about child man in the promised land, and it's looking at how men just have so many options, and this is why they're doing what they're doing. But my point in my book is that men are not they're not going to participate in a society that is not going to reward them for that behavior. In other words, if you're a good father, a good husband, and you do all of the things you're supposed to do, the society still will go after you if you step out of line in any particular way. In the old days, it was sort of like 50 years ago, a man was head of household, looked up to, treated with respect. And now a married man in many ways is seen as less of a man, not more of one. And it's doubly so if he has kids. We see the whole, he's no longer Ward Cleaver. He's some schlub carrying around a flower diaper bag. And there are huge risks involved in divorce, which is very, very unfriendly to men. When we look at the workplace, the sexual harassment laws and the growth of HR bureaucracies, which are mostly made up of women, these are hostile environments to men. And people don't think about that. They think of hostile environments as only places that things happen to women. There was even an interesting article at Forbes written by Kyle Smith, who is one of the contributors. And interestingly enough, he pointed out a study that showed that something like 93% of HRs are made up of women. And a lot of times these women are choosing people to hire who are either unattractive women or attractive men. And so ugly men, the only thing that studies generally care about is, pretty women aren't getting picked for jobs. But what we need to do is look at the flip side. How are men being affected in the workplace? How are they being affected in the family? How are they being, affected in our society? We only look at how women are affected in our society and our culture. We just don't care about how men are affected. And that's why I wrote the book, is to talk about in what ways are men affected.
There's a sort of universal theme in 20th century thought, really starts in 19th century thought, of a kind of an idea of a revolution by the victim group against the victimizer group, against the power base, right? So archetypally, the power base is white, male, Christian, phallocentric, logocentric, capitalist. There's this list of the things, imperial, etc., a list of ways in which a certain group of people are said to have victimized the entire world. And then all these different groups have their liberation moment, but the liberation moment doesn't seem to want to stop at a moment of liberation. It seems to want to go on to an inversion, a kind of comeuppance, a kind of now it's your turn.
Right.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I thought that feminism was supposed to be about equality. I was somewhat of a feminist, or I was very much a feminist when I was younger, and because I had this idea, naively, that it was about equality, that we wanted to see men and women as equals. Instead, women today want special privileges and no responsibilities, or very little, and they want men to have the responsibilities, but none of the privilege. And I think as you point out, there's the problem.
You mentioned a number of institutions in which men feel uncomfortable. No, it's actually not a matter of feeling uncomfortable. It's a matter of actually being disadvantaged. There's one you haven't mentioned yet, which is something that overlaps with an interest of mine and of your husband, Glenn Reynolds, the idea of a college bubble, the idea of a higher education system in which the value of the product has become completely dissociated from the price of it. Talk to me a little bit about, what do you call it, Girltown, about the universities as sort of a world hostile to men.
Right, I call it Girlington, but actually that's
Girlington, yes.
Girlington, and that's sort of like Burlington. There's so many women at the University of Vermont, they call the place Girlington as opposed to, Burlington. But,
yes, it's clever.
What's interesting is that men, it's something like 60% almost, reaching 60% women going to college, 40% men. And I think you're right. I think that I don't think it's just the higher education bubble that I know that my husband, Glenn Reynolds, is interested in that, and that he's writing, actually has a new book called The New School coming out about that very topic. But I think that actually what's happening is not only is the commodity much less desirable to men, but I think that the environment itself is actively hostile towards men. So I think you have two things going on. I think you've got a commodity college, which isn't to men as important as it used to be, and there are other things that men are finding to do. And at the same time, I think the discrimination against men in these diversity field, women-dominated schools is also acting as a kind of a barrier to men. A lot of men don't want to put up with it, and people think, well, of course that's not really happening, but people have no idea what men face in our colleges today. For example, they can go into a college today and be charged with any type of sexual harassment or sexual abuse, and there doesn't have to be really proof shown that they've done something. And there are a lot of cases across the country, and I know that Greg Lukianos wrote a book, a very interesting book about some of these things where men actually can be charged with a very low preponderance of evidence for things as, for crimes as hideous as rape. And there are campus tribunals at some of these colleges that just say, you know what, we think you did it and you're out of school.
The presumption of innocence doesn't function in these campus tribunals.
No, it really doesn't. And there was a really fascinating article written in the Wall Street Journal by, I believe, Judith Grossman, talking about that very issue, where her son was actually accused, and she was a lawyer and was able to help him. But there are many men who don't have this type of access, don't have a lawyer or as a mother, and don't have any way to get any help. And I think that even if you get through the tribunal, there's still the tribunal of community opinion. Think about the lacrosse players who were accused of raping Crystal Magnum. Was that the stage name of the stripper who accused them of rape and then later recanted? Can you imagine how these men must feel? It's just in our society, we don't care how men feel. We only care about how women feel.
So that's part of that idea that the traditional victim group is given all benefit of the doubt, and the assigned victimizer group is given no benefit of the doubt.
Hardly any at all. And the thing is, One of the things that's really hard is that men are not used to fighting back in this way. This is a cultural war. And I think men are used to fighting, for country. They're used to fighting, I kind of tell men when
they're not used to fighting women.
No, they absolutely. I think fighting women or fighting the bureaucracies that help women, because it's not just women. Like people say, well, you're just trying to blame women. No, what I blame are the unfair laws and the political system that turns against men in this way. It's not, yes, in part it is women. Politicians placate women because they do provide, sometimes a majority of the vote.
Well, it's a good point. Then they're fighting women as a symbol, right?
Yes.
A politician who wants to gain power uses the victimized woman as a symbol to gain power for himself.
Exactly, and that kind of goes to what I talk about in the book.
He's going to put all the deadbeat dads in prison, right? So he's running for judge. I'm going to put all the deadbeat dads in prison, and that might mean the deadbeat dad might not even be the father of the child. The paternity test might actually show he's not genetically the father of the child, but if your political shtick is you're going after deadbeat dads, then you're already sort of biasing the legal system against the father.
Right, and everybody hears that alliteration, deadbeat dad. It sounds horrible, but here's the reality. The reality is that there are more women out there. The percentage of women is very, very low who actually pay child support. It's something like, 18%. It's very, very low. Right. And of those women who are told to pay child support, there are many more of those women who are in arrears, who don't pay the child support than there are fathers. But we never think of a deadbeat mom because people feel sorry for them. They think there's a reason. If you're a deadbeat dad, somehow you're miraculously supposed to come up with money, even if you have been laid off from your job. So we give women a break. We don't give men a break. But, and I think that I always find it just sort of amazing that people just somehow think that men, and maybe this goes through, the traditional, kind of way we see men is they're capable of anything. They can work through something. It's not really that big a deal. They don't have any feelings, but indeed men do have feelings, a great number of feelings. And not only do I know this from my work of treating men for over 20 years, but we can see it in even the suicide statistics, in which there are 38,000 people in this country who kill themselves every year, and over 30,000 of those are men.
That's amazing. That's an amazing gender disequilibrium or inequality, as the liberals would say, that we hear almost nothing about. 38,000 suicides a year, 30,000 of them are men.
Yes, and we don't hear anything. The only thing we usually hear is maybe something about teen suicide, but it's always mentioned as teen suicide. Or I've even seen brochures for suicide hotlines, and there's usually a young girl a young woman on the front, or, people care about women's suicide because women attempt suicide oftentimes more often than men, but they don't generally complete it. For women, it's oftentimes more of a cry for help, and men, they simply find, a way to kill themselves, and that's it. But from the work that I've done, I've really seen that there are ways to reach out and help men. And the problem is both that men don't trust the mental health professionals because most of them are women. Most of them don't really understand where men are coming from. Many of them don't realize it, but they're, in some sense, some of them are biased against men and don't really realize some of the ways in which men act out or show depression. One of the interesting things is people think that when a man's depressed, he's going to be like sitting around like a woman, and he's going to be eating bonbons, and he's going to be upset and gaining weight or losing weight or whatever. But with men, they tend to act out more. And I do think there is some tie between some of these men who are severely depressed and mentally ill, who go out on a rampage and shoot up a mall. And that's an extreme example of depression, and how depression turned outward can be have a devastating consequence in our society, and how we really need to focus on this issue, because I think because we tend to ignore men and their problems, we have more and more men who not only are they opting out, as I talk about in my book, but they're also making rash decisions and doing rash things in order to get the kind of attention and resources they need.
And it's interesting, it doesn't trigger the usual bells and whistles of if someone is acting out, what happened? And, for example, remember after September 11th, all of the why do they hate us? We have to understand their rage, right? There was this, at least in the chattering classes and intellectual circles, there was all of this hand-wringing about, well, why is it that the Palestinians this, or why is it that the Iranians or Afghan? What have we done? What pushed them to this point? Whether that's a useful exercise or not, I'm not sure. I think there's some value in understanding your enemy, but probably not so much value in wallowing in his value system. But when some guy shoots up the courthouse and who's involved in some kind of loss of, when he loses the custody of his children, no one says, well, wait, let's try to understand his rage, or why does he hate them? He's just evil, plainly, and there's no one points at the system. Not that the system would exonerate him, but no one points to the ways in which the system might help create men who do terrible evils like that.
Right. In other words, we're willing to give the benefit of the doubt to a group of terrorists, but not to the very men who live in the United States who we might be able to reach out and help. It's really pathetic, and I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, even after there was a guy, Thomas Ball, a few years back, who set himself on fire on the steps of a courthouse after being denied access, I guess, to his kids, his family.
Yes.
Set himself on fire, and a lot of the feminists came out, and it was one in particular who her basic thing was, this man's just doing this to get back at women. I mean, this is, you know what I'm saying? No understanding, no concern over
yes.
Like, what happened, why, what was going through this guy's mind, I'm not saying
there he is sitting burning alive, and he's still the perpetrator. He's still not the victim.
Right.
Because of that Y chromosome. He can never be the victim. No matter what the circumstances, he is designated forever as the perpetrator, not the victim.
Right. And I think when you do this to people, there's a sense of helplessness. And I think what's happening with men is there's just a sense of, you know what, there's nothing really I can do. The society doesn't care about me. And so I think most men, a lot of men, not most, but there is a certain segment of the population that simply is opting out to sort of do their own thing. And, and some men are very successful at this. I talk in the book a little bit about going galt, and that would be where you're sort of, going out, doing your own thing, and sort of opting out of the system. So a lot of men are saying to themselves,
you withdraw from the system. This is from the novel Atlas Shrugged. You say, the system has abused me enough, I'm going to walk away, and if it falls, it falls.
Right. Thank you for the clarification. That's exactly right. And I talk about that in the first chapter of my book. But, there are men who are basically living pretty happy lives. They're not getting married as often. They're there are a lot of men, believe it or not, 5% of men in this country are living now on Social Security disability, and that's a sad commentary on the times that we live in. I don't advocate this. I think it's terrible, but at the same time, I totally understand the sentiment of saying, you know what, why go and get this job and kill myself, especially if you're older, because it's like there's not really that much reward for it. And a lot of women don't really even want men as much anymore, because women can use the government in ways, whether that be for health care, whether that be for, help with their kids or whatever, and they can use that as the government as substitute kids. And you see that more and more with
the state becomes the new family.
Yes.
Right? The state is the new father, who will protect you, provide for you. He's the new child who will, care for you in your old age. The state is the ersatz family, kind of in the old fascist model. You're just sort of denying the distinction between state and society. The state is now the new family of humanity, and Julia will have a father and husband and son without ever actually having to have an actual father, husband, and son to get through life. The federal government is that.
Right. And you see more and more women voting that way. And in fact, I just recently saw something about, I think it was at CNBC or somewhere, where they were talking about how the new Obamacare, people who are buying Obamacare, mostly young women. And so they like the things that the state provides, because it's a way of just, if you're not married, or you just simply use the state to get those types of things, and then you can feel more independent. You don't really need a man. You don't have to put up with anything. But it's a really sad situation, because I don't think these women are particularly happy this way, and the research sort of bears that out. I mean, they've become less and less happy since the 1970s.
Yes, well, the ideology tells them they'll be happy without men, but some deep, just sort of human nature reality says we're not happy without each other, right? I mean, the oldest book ever says it's not good for the man to be alone, right? It's not good for the woman to be alone, that there's something about the relationship between men and women that nothing else in the world can ever fully satisfy. Not the state, not video games, not a great college education, not a great career. We need each other, but modern ideologies deny that need, but they're cold comfort when someone gets to be 35 or 40 or 45 and they're not married and no prospect of marriage.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem is when women do become that age, say 35 to 40, they're looking around, they're saying what's happened, and then they start to care. But the men that I talk to who are 35 to 40 are now turning around and looking at the 20 to 25-year-old women, and they're really not that interested as much in those women who are older. So it gets to be sort of a vicious cycle of those women not having anyone. And, you know,
yes, and you make a big point about the alpha male. The alpha male has his pick of the women. So the 40-year-old alpha male can have as many 25 to 30-year-old women as sexual partners as he wants.
Yes, and it's an unfortunate, you know, kind of fact of life. And the problem is with the alpha males is that women's standards now are so high because so many more women are educated. So many women have graduate degrees and, you know, college degrees, and they want a man who has equal college education or higher, or a man who makes as much money as they do or more. But men are making less and less money. They're going to college less and less often. So the pool of those available men becomes smaller. I think it was so fascinating. Like I was at a party the other day and there was one guy talking about how there's no men for women anymore. But I think what it is there are men because we have equal numbers of men and women up to a certain age. But I think what's happening is women are deeming most men undesirable. Those undesirable men kind of drop out. They say to heck with it.
There's no hypergamic men, right? Talk a little bit about hypergamy or hypergamy. This is not a word we find often in public discussion, and I think it's an important word. Tell us a little bit about that idea, please.
Well, James Toronto from the Wall Street Journal talks a lot about hypergamy, and that is basically where women want a higher status male. In other words, they want somebody who makes more money than them, who has higher status, and women tend to, I mean, it's almost, some people think it's evolutionary. I'm not particularly on that side. I mean, I think one of the things women might want to do is start to look at other aspects, and maybe as we evolve, in a certain sense, other things will become more important. But most women do feel that way. Most women do want someone who obviously is more educated and does at least have a good job, if not makes more money than them. So I think that leaves a lot of men out in the cold, particularly given the economic times. I know the Brookings Institute.
Right, and it also leaves the hypergamic 40 to 50-year-old without alpha men her age, because the alpha men her age can get 25-year-olds. Right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Right. James Toronto, I think his foil for this to a large degree has been the New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd, who's written kind of bitter columns about there aren't any men anymore. Well, it's okay. There aren't any men who are Maureen Dowd's age who want to marry Maureen Dowd, who fit her power couple idea of someone that she can look up to. Well, that's true. But that doesn't mean there aren't men. That doesn't mean there aren't men her age. It just means that you've got a kind of a disequilibrium in the marketplace. I'm wondering to what degree the sexual revolution has helped create this disequilibrium. That if a alpha male can have 5 women kind of on a string, then doesn't that sort of, look, I'm an economist, I look at this in economic terms, doesn't that stop the market from coming to to a clearing price, to a point of equilibrium?
I think that's part of it. And on the other side, there's the men who are not the alpha males. Those top 20% of men are kind of left out in the cold. In the old days where we had marriage, I mean, most people, because of the culture, because of the society and the mores, we were expected, you know, to get married. So women just looked around and everybody sort of had to pair up. So you just had to find, you know, somebody who, even if they weren't your ideal, good enough. Exactly. Yeah. Well, we don't do that anymore.
And then you learn to love them. Right? Yeah. He learns to love her. She learns to love him. But in the beginning, it's just, there's a little bit of kind of settling, you know, they call it satisficing in economic theory. Good enough for now. And maybe he's a fixer-upper. He'll change. I'll make him a better man, and he'll help her to be a better woman, and you sort of grow together, right?
But we don't have that anymore. The whole culture tells, not men, because men are just supposed to take whatever's given to them, but women are told you are always entitled to the best. You are a star. You're a princess. There is nothing you can't do. Most women have very high self-esteem because the culture, we tell women how great they are every day. What do we talk about all day long is what illnesses do women have? What are the problems women have? How do women feel? all TV shows, women watch TV.
Yes.
They basically, all shows are made for them. The political system is more or less made for women.
And the romantic comedy industry
Yes.
is an engine of dissatisfaction, right? Have you seen the new movie, Don John?
I have not. I'm not a big movie watcher.
Okay, well, the premise is a man and a woman, they're interested in one another. He's into porn, she's into romantic comedies, so he has completely unrealistic expectations about what a woman should look like and what she should do, right? A point that you make in the book Men on Strike, but she's got completely misplaced expectations about what she can expect. And so they're both living in fantasy worlds of unrealistically high expectations.
Oh, that's fascinating.
But men's unrealistically high expectations kind of turn to porn in many cases, not to high achieving women. I mean, when men are kind of indulging their fantasy, they're not imagining 150 IQ generally.
Well, that's not what men want. Women who look a particular way. Women
Yes.
are much more drawn to power and status and those other things. But you bring up a good point, which is just that we see men using porn as sort of a very negative thing. We have very, negative ideas in our society about porn in some sense. But at the same time, with women, we never think about the fact that they're into romantic comedy and how these change their perceptions of how men should be. And why is that okay? But the porn for men is, you always see the women's magazines filled with women questioning, why is a man looking at porn? I mean, I've had women talk to me and they're like horrified that their husband's looking at porn. I'm like, well, every husband looks at porn. Every man looks at porn. There have been studies that have shown that there was one study where they tried to find a man who hadn't seen porn to do a control group when there weren't any. There are, most men, I can't say 100%, but most men look at porn. And in some sense, that's another aspect.
Or I'll add in my own defense, or have in the distant past.
Yeah. Okay. Well, but it's one of those things that I think, men who do have a harder time getting women, those men who aren't the alpha males now do have access to porn. So I think the fact that there is such easy access to porn.
Yes, they have a harem available for free, or for maybe $9.95 if you want a slightly higher quality.
Right.
I assume that's what it costs. I don't have any direct experience. Right. So there's the Insta harem, right? And that's part of the dropping out. Okay. Let's, this doesn't start with college, by the way. I mean, this Christina Hoff Sommers, who is in some ways the predecessor to the way you're thinking, or therefore you are in some ways successor, talked about the war on boys as starting long before college. So this is kind of the whole educational system, almost from the beginning, starts to treat boyhood as a disease. I'm the father of 4 boys and 3 girls.
Wow.
So I've seen from personal experience how boys act differently from girls. And I can see how maybe some teachers, especially women teachers, would look at one type of acting as acting out and another type of acting as acting well, when in fact it's just a gender difference. So I'm wondering to what degree this system is stacked against them way before they get to college, or way before they, get to divorce court, that the system is stacked against them, almost from the first time they go to kindergarten, or from the first time they turn on a television.
Well, we can see that from the media reports. I mean, when you see like a little boy who points his finger at somebody and says bam, and the next thing you know, he's being whisked off to the principal's office, or worse, expelled from the school. We see that every day, and there really, I believe there is almost like a war against boys in our educational system. And maybe it's not so much a war as, I think that most teachers now are women.
Maybe it's more of an occupation than an outright war.
Yeah, it's
it's a little bit like, okay,
right.
We're here, we're colonizing you, we're going to make you.
Well, we don't
act
want
like
any trouble, and you're a troublemaker. And the way that schools have gone now is, if you're a conformist type who likes to sit still and literally put sprinkles and glitter on things, then you'll do fine. But if you want to be active and you want to get out of your seat, and you want to have recess, and you want to do other things, and you want to read, action books, and like many boys want to do, and girls too. I'm not, there are girls overlapping there who also are having problems, but, here we're specifically talking about boys. But I absolutely agree. I think that early in the schools, from the time they hit, kindergarten, our school systems are set up, as the normal situation is to do what girls do. You want a situation where people sit still, they do rote memory, they simply parrot back.
fill out the forms.
Yes.
Don't go outside of the line with the number 2 pencil.
Right. And boys aren't very good at that. Boys are, they're less well at that than girls. And I think that the teachers penalize them, and they've actually done studies. The London School of Economics did a study, and they actually found that women teachers grade boys based on their behavior, not their merit. And that's unfortunate because, they do boys tend to get worse grades, and those worse grades follow them. And that's one of the reasons that you see fewer boys going to college is because their grades tend to be lower. The reason they're lower a lot of times is that they're penalized for their behavior.
Is it possible that this isn't all ideology? I mean, you've pointed out a kind of a misandry ideological tilt in our institutions, right? That boys are the problem because of a history of patriarchy and all the other imperialism and all the other isms which allegedly made the world a horrible place before 1968. But it seems to me that there's also structural elements here, that it is hard for a bureaucracy to not want to hammer down or eradicate in some ways the things that make boys distinctive from girls. So a public school system that has an ideology of, you remember the Ophelia syndrome, girls never raise their hand, right? That has an ideology is going to be hard on boys. But to be honest with you, as a boy who grew up kind of before that ideology, I mean, I was, in grammar school in the 60s. School was pretty hard anyway. In other words, I'm wondering if bureaucratic institutions like a public school system that's top down as opposed to homeschooling, cyberschooling, apprenticeship, and all these other things, distance learning as opposed to going to university, whether even if you got rid of the anti-male ideology, whether or not perhaps a highly bureaucratized society that centers around a highly bureaucratized school system might have an anti-male bias even when it doesn't have an anti-male ideology.
So,
do you understand the question, or did I put it poorly?
I mean, partly. Can you kind of rephrase a little bit to me? You want to know, like, you think it's just the idea that there's this big bureaucracy that sort of, it's easier on them if they simply have people sit in a seat and do what they're told to do because it just makes for an easier time.
Yes, I'm saying that bureaucracies inherently are intolerant of the distinctive male characteristics of more physicality, more acting out, more aggressiveness, more ambition.
Well, I think it sort of rises from some of the ideologies of the 60s where we feel that we can't discipline children anymore. And I think what happens is because there are all female teachers, we used to have male teachers who could discipline. Now we have all female teachers who can't discipline. So it's just, we can't have kids who act out because there's nothing you can really do with them. So what you try to do is eradicate their behavior. For example, if you've got a boy in the classroom, he's acting up, you might get a call from a teacher at the psychologist saying that, or a parent saying that the teachers want this child looked into for medication or evaluated for ADHD, or that's a lot easier because, and I think in bureaucracies like the school system, as they've gotten more and more bureaucratic, I definitely think they've actually pulled ideas from the culture, and I think the culture says that we are not to discipline children. We don't believe in that anymore, and I think that's one reason kids go to school and there's nothing. Honestly, the school system they do have their hands tied. I've worked with lots of schools. I have a PhD.
Oh, sure, there's no discipline. I mean, around the time I was a kid is when they were getting rid of spanking in schools.
Right.
Which I fully supported. At the time, I was fully in support of that, because I was the sort that would get spanked a lot. But something is lost. I guess where I'm coming from a certain point of view on this, and it's all right if you're not, but we're homeschoolers, and we don't have any of these problems. The boys learn like boys and the girls learn like girls because there's no warehousing issue. If the boys want to get up and go out there and, I don't know, split wood for a while, they can. If they want to go out and, hit the punching bag or throw a ball around or whatever, they can do it just so long as their work is done by the end of the day. And it just seems like a lot of this boy-girl crisis in schools starts with the fact that we had a bureaucracy there in the first place. And when you debureaucratize the system, then these gender wars just kind of disappear. We don't have gender wars here. The girls act like girls, the boys act like boys, and their only requirement is that they learn the stuff and learn it on time.
Well, and I think part of it is that you're able to, number one, you know the kids better, and you're able to, we've got so many, like we've got teachers who are dealing with a classroom of 30 students. If one or two kids are a discipline problem, remember, there's nothing they can do. They have no ability to discipline. I've even had teachers tell me that, if they do bring up a child is a behavioral problem, they tell the teacher it's their problem. There's nothing that can be done. So I think that, if there are I think with the bureaucracies, they have to have sort of hard and fast rules. And the hard and fast rule is don't think too much. There's no critical thinking. If the kid brings a butter knife to school, you treat that as he brought a gun. Don't worry about it. Expel him and the problem's solved. So I think you're right. I think they don't have to, but there's no critical thought. In your house, you're probably looking at it, okay, there's some critical thought. Jimmy likes to be outside doing X, and he's, and you've got the ability to supervise. Remember with 30.
And they have pen knives. And we're perfectly comfortable with that. We don't have a zero policy, we don't have a zero tolerance policy against pen knives. We know they're not murderers.
Right. And now I think the way our communities are, the way people move around, and you've got new kids coming in schools, nobody knows each other. We've got this whole theme of, nobody, we're not really a community as much anymore. And so in your family, you are a community, and you can know each person, and you can help in some sense. So I agree that I think we've become sort of almost this faceless bureaucracy where everybody has sort of they try to push everybody into the same mold, and what they try to do is make things as easy as possible without any critical thinking, and it's the easiest thing to do. And also I really believe from a political standpoint that it's very into anything to do with girls. If you do something positive for girls, people applaud you, say you're doing great. If you do something positive for boys, the only one who really cares are some of the parents who might care. But politically and ideologically, the system isn't going to be really rewarded as much for doing anything for boys.
Is there any place, as you look around society, is there any place you see where we don't have this problem? Is there any subculture, subsector, sector, region, any patch of humanity where you look and say, oh, men aren't on strike and I can see why they're not?
Probably in the technology world, and maybe I would think in some of maybe the building trades, but even those are sort of being corrupted in a sense. I mean, now we see, especially in the hard sciences, engineering, those used to be male dominated. Now, a lot of guys tell me, and this is just what I hear from the emails I get, a lot of men tell me who are in engineering that a lot of the professors favor the girls, that they kind of will bend over backwards to give a good grade to a girl while they have to do all the work and they still don't do quite as well. But I think as far as, what we really see are like Google or, all of I think in terms of just being an entrepreneur, I think those are the places where it really stands out because men are able to take those risks and to do those things that reward individual achievement, and they're becoming harder and harder. There are more and more regulations and things for.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. If the gulch, is that what it's called in Atlas Shrugged, where they all right? Mm-hmm. If gulch is a free zone, but and if entrepreneurship is the gulch, the problem is that in the age of high regulation, we have much lower entrepreneurship rates now. So that's one less city of refuge that the high-achieving man who doesn't want to sit through 4 years of college and all the indoctrination, or through a big corporation and all the HR, gender sensitivity stuff, that's another city of refuge that's kind of shrinking that they can't go to now.
It is shrinking. I attended a seminar recently. It was on women entrepreneurs, and what was interesting is one of the experts there was saying that women's businesses in the entrepreneurship are growing very quickly. Men's are, not growing as much. So that does concern me. One of the things though is what they consider an entrepreneur for a woman is doing anything that is, that women like. For example, doing blogging on something to do with, mommy bloggers or other areas, or selling things to women. Because I think that women are, women like to buy things. Women have control usually over the family finances. And so those types of things are growing in our economy right now. The things that men do, I think, are not as, are not being paid as much.
Right. And there's also kind of a hobby farm aspect to this. There's a lot of, look, there's an entrepreneur who starts a business and 10 years later it's got 10,000 employees. but then there's someone who does some graphic design at home or some catering or some calligraphy or something like that. Not to pigeonhole women as, always going to
No, some of them do
fields.
some pretty amazing things, actually.
They do, that's right. And listen, who am I to, my wife is the CEO of a media company. But not all entrepreneurship is created equal. I think when you look at sort of entrepreneurship, meaning the gazelle phenomenon, a business that starts small and gets very big, that still tends to be more men. Although you do have your, you do have some in apparel and food. You have had some success stories, but nothing, say, on the scale of a Google or an Apple or something of that nature. Okay, so what I'm hearing is you're having trouble finding any place in the world where this isn't going on. That the cities of refuge there aren't really many.
Well, I
many
think that
of them.
men are just sort of creating their own refuge and
In the basement.
I mean, unfortunately, I think that's sort of accurate. Or they've sort of bailed out and they do their own thing. A lot of guys are self-employed and they do. I talk to a lot of guys and they say, I live alone. I have a pickup truck and I just enjoy my hobbies, and they work whatever job they do. And they honestly, a lot of them feel very good about their lives. They feel that, things are going okay for them. But as you were talking before, my biggest worry is how will that deal with the innovation? If we were stopping the innovators from producing, the producers from producing, and we are penalizing those people who are risk takers and who are entrepreneurs and who, have big ideas, we don't want to do that to men, or women. And I think it's a shame because I think those traits, a lot of men do tend to have a lot of those traits and are willing to take a lot of risks. It's sort of it's interesting because people talk about, well, men are all at the top, but they don't notice that men are at the bottom and that women tend to congregate in the middle. Most middle managers are women. The HR departments are women. And I wonder if you ask women, okay, we're going to trade off. You're going to be at the very bottom and a few of you will be at the top. Would you take that trade and let men all be, not all, but mostly be in the middle? And I don't.
Right. That's the Rawlsian wager, right? If you be familiar with that idea in political philosophy, sort of the liberal political philosopher says, imagine you're not born yet and you get to choose what kind of society you're going to be born into, right? And the idea is you could be at the top or you could be at the bottom. What do you choose? And Rawls argues, well, everyone's going to choose the welfare state where there's like, no one gets really rich, but then no one gets really poor. I think there's other problems with that, namely that the diminution of freedom is itself a harm. But there's a kind of idea that people tend to be more frightened of the bottom than they are inspired by the top.
I believe that because I think most people, maybe they think they're not able to reach the top, and so they figure I'll at least get what I can get. I think that even looking at our political system, that's sort of what's happening. People would rather take the chance that, okay, I can get some, supposedly free health care, and I can sort of make it in today's world. Sure, I may not be at the top, I may not even be middle or anything, but at least I'm not going to be at the bottom.
What would you say to someone like me who's basically given up on this problem?
Given up?
Given up. I read your book and I see N.K. Himowitz to some degree and Christina Hoff Sommers, and I say they're fighting the good fight, but I think this ideology and these bureaucracies are unreformable. So I just, drop out in the sense of we homeschool, we're entrepreneurs, we don't have anything to do with any of it.
I say congratulations to you, and it's amazing that you can do that. And I think if more people did that and just dropped out, that I think it will sort of be a long tail situation where, a lot of people, there'll be a lot of little, the United States maybe will become a place where there are little enclaves of people such as yourself, and nobody is going to be as connected to these big institutions. Maybe they'll die. But I doubt it.
Or maybe just sort of be barely alive, this system of indoctrination and power and ideology. If we all just ignore it, it might, what do they say? What if they have a war and nobody shows up? Well, okay, what if they have a...
But I don't think that's happening because the people who are showing, here's what's the problem is, as you're dropping out, the only people left are, say, the 10 or 20% of hardcore feminists and their sycophants who are basically with them saying, okay, now we're left and we're in charge, and you're leaving those people in charge of a bureaucracy. People are forced to go to school. A lot of people don't have the luxury of having or don't have anyone who could maybe homeschool them. A lot of people, it's mandatory. The government forces you to participate in these institutions. We all have to participate in some way. We're not immune to them.
So you still have to pay for the public schools.
You have to pay for it. Not only do you have to pay for it, but you're the recipient of people are trained through these programs. And what I would say is don't give up. I would say fight the good fight and don't give up, and look to organizations like, for example, FIRE, the Freedom and Education or Individual
Rights and Education.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
But that is a great organization. When I tell a lot of young men who write me, maybe to contact them, because those are organizations that can help. And I would also say, don't let women control the dialogue. Don't let women don't stand back as a man. Or believe it or not, I get many women who care fiercely about these issues, who stand up for men, who, people think, well, it's just, women don't care. Well, some of them do care. They have sons, or, even some of them, it's not even a matter. People say to me, I don't have sons. I have a daughter, but I believe in justice. And I think that if you believe in justice and you believe in fairness, that you will stand and fight. So there aren't men who have to set themselves on fire on the courthouse steps, and there aren't men in our society who are committing suicide at a rapid rate with nobody that cares. And there are school systems that see the value in young boys who sit in class and are 7 years old, who are going to be put on medication, which I'm not against medication. I'm at all, but I don't want.
Right, but there's certain percentages. If 60% of the boys are on Ritalin, then who's crazy, the boys or the schools, right?
Exactly. And I don't want to live in a society that says that's okay, I'm opting out. I can't opt out of that. And
I'm glad you're not opting out, but I'm still opting out.
No, you know what? It's each his own. But I think that, to listeners out there, I'm hoping that, I think when some speak up, that's often good enough. And I do see men fighting back. I see it every day. I have men who write me about the things that they're doing. I see men writing op-eds about what's happening. They're on the internet. They're speaking out. There's a lot of men's rights activists out there on the web.
And we are speaking out. I've read your book. I'm passing it around, and we're doing a column about it. So I'll at least try to reform the bureaucracy that much.
So because of that, I don't believe you're opting out. I think you're just choosing to use your talents to get other people's views out there, and I thank you for that.
I guess I'm influenced by your husband, Glenn Reynolds, and the David versus Goliath. It's like, any system that's obsolete is going to fall eventually. The way I help reform that system is by replacing it. By doing the best in my little way to replace it with something better. But the column's not about what I'm doing. So it's about what your book is saying and about what you're finding, and it's fascinating research. By the way, I haven't read all of it. I've read almost all of the book. So if this question indicates that there's a part that I didn't read, which is I kind of read the last chapter and then everything but the last chapter. I read books sort of back to front and then front to back. So if I miss this, that's fine. But I'm not seeing anything about kind of a discussion that I've heard a lot about lately about men opting out of church.
Oh, yes.
Do you have anything in the book on that, or do you have thoughts on it?
I have thoughts on it. Unfortunately, after I've talked to a lot of large national Christian shows, and that's one of the things that we talk about. And there isn't a big thing in the book about that. But there's a terrific book by David Morrow, who wrote a book called Why Men Hate Church. Yes. And he talks a lot about these issues, about the feminization of churches and and I think even the Jewish, I think Glenn had a post about the Jewish congregations. A lot of men are going over to the Orthodox.
Yes, because the Reform congregations are the same thing.
Right. They're very feminized, and they're always telling men, like you said in the beginning of our interview, scolding them in that kind of tone. Like, who needs to go to church and hear that? You're no good. You're a deadbeat. You do it. And there's this whole theme where they're placating women, because most of the congregations, 60% or more, are women. So what you've basically got is you've got the pastor up there, and then you've got a group of women. And so the pastor sort of goes along and tries to placate the women and do what he thinks is good for them, because the men just don't show up. But I think that's a really important issue, and men are not going to church as much anymore and aren't participating because religion has become so feminized, and it does not reward risk-taking. It does not reward competition and all of those things that many men feel are important.
Yes, and I'm afraid I observe the same thing. And so an institution that I would hope to get more hope out of is not yet pointing the way to a solution to this problem. So on we go with our different strategies for dealing with it. The book is Men on Strike. Dr. Helen Smith is the author. Dr. Smith, before we leave off, anything else you think we ought to know? Anything that I should have asked that didn't, or something that you just feel like you want to say that you did not get a chance to bring up in this interview?
No, I feel like I got to include a lot of information, and I appreciate such a great forum to sort of spread the word. But I mean, I guess I'd like to say that what I'm amazed by with this book is how many people say, well, aren't the feminists giving you a hard time? And I'm like, no. The thing is about my book is one of the things that I've found is that I've reached men who thought they were alone with their thoughts and about these things. And it makes me feel that if nothing else, that was worth it. It was worth writing just because it's reached so many men who feel that, you know, something, what I think, you know, there is something wrong. I can't put my finger on it. And this book sort of touches or sort of helps to, helps me to understand a little bit about what's going on and why, you know, many men don't want to get married, or men, feel that they don't have as many rights in society anymore. So, it's been a real privilege to be able to reach out to men in that way, and have them write me and talk to me about their feelings and their ideas and their hopes for the future.
As a writer and a speaker, I can tell you there's almost nothing better than when you say something out loud or on television or radio, or write something and somebody out there says, wow, I'm changed. I'm not alone. I didn't know anyone thought this way. Now some pain in my life makes sense. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much the most gratifying thing you can get as a writer.
It is. I think it's fantastic. And it doesn't bother me if there are people who are negative about, you know, I mean, I guess anybody who stands up for a man in this society is a pariah, but it seems like there are so many, great men and a lot of women who do care about this issue. So hopefully, rather than opting out, we will, continue to fight the good fight.
Well, I think it's something important to realize is being pro-man isn't being anti-woman.
No, not at all. I'm very pro-woman. I mean, I think women have a lot of great qualities, but I think that we have to understand that so do men and to treat them accordingly.
Okay. Dr. Smith, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks so much, Jerry, for having me on your show. I appreciate it.